Okay, in this video tutorial we're going to look quickly at how fossil fuels are obtained or extracted. We'll start with coal. Coal is a solid form, and essentially it's just basically dug out of the ground. Now there are different ways you can do that, but they're either split into underground mining methods or surface mining methods. So underground means like, a coal, what you often think of as a coal mine. An elevator or a shaft goes down deep into the ground, so you dig something down, and then there's a series of shafts that go sort of more sideways and follow the coal seam to extract that coal. Some of them are sloping like this, or some of them go sideways into maybe a mountain, is one way to get at it. The other method is basically just to dig a giant crater in the ground or a pit and extract the coal that way. So coal essentially basically needs to be dug out of the ground, and these open methods can look quite impressive. Just the sheer magnitude of them. You can see here is a picture of an open cast mine, and there'll be coal in some of these layers here, and they've essentially just dug out all of what you see there. So massive. It involves moving massive amounts of rock and earth and things like that, but obviously obtains large amounts of coal too. So how is coal obtained? Basically mining, and whether that's an open cast or an underground mine, it depends on the region and how deep it is, and whether it's flat or whether there's a mountain, and you can dig into the side of that. Crude oil or petroleum is obtained through drilling. So essentially they drill a pipeline down into the ground, and apparently this has been done by the Chinese for hundreds of years, and initially just involved basically drilling using bamboo poles with some sort of drill bit, probably metal, I imagine, attached to the bottom, and they were actually able to drill several hundred meters down. These days they can drill thousands and thousands of meters down, but they were able to drill several hundred meters down and obtain petroleum, which would come up the shaft up through bamboo pipes. And they would use that for heating, and apparently they'd use that to boil off seawater to obtain salt. Interesting that it's actually probably been around longer than we think. And if the oil isn't that deep, this essentially you can just dig a well yourself, just dig a hole that's 10, 20, 30 meters deep. So we're still talking about a very big hole, but one that people could actually dig, and oil could seep out of the surrounding rock and layers if it's very shallow. Now most oil reserves these days are a lot deeper and involve essentially drilling thousands of meters into the rock to obtain that. So the oil is usually, as we said in the last video, crude oil or petroleum is often trapped. It's in often porous rocks. It's made its way up into porous rocks. It's under pressure. It's less dense than water, so it would float on water, or less dense than the water in the rock. So from that perspective, it'll also try and move upward. And it's often trapped beneath sort of layers of more impermeable rock that doesn't have pores in it, or little holes or cracks. And you basically have to drill through that, and then the oil will seep up through the drill pipe, and you can extract it. Now it's often pumped out just to increase the rate at which it comes out, but the oil would probably come up itself due to the pressure, and also the fact that it's less dense than water and rock. I guess that depends on the circumstance and the pressure. But again, in the early days, some people literally basically just dug a giant hole in an area, and out came oil. Now these days, obviously we go much deeper, and we can even do that offshore. So sometimes the oil is beneath the ocean floor, and that's where you get what we often call oil rigs. And these can be like towers and things, but a lot of them are actually floating, which is almost difficult to believe given their size, and they just look so big and heavy. But if you don't believe me, here's a here's a picture of one actually being transported on a boat. So this is actually an oil rig. So petroleum is essentially obtained through drilling, and through more impermeable rock layers until you hit rock layers that have the petroleum or crude oil down below, and often actually you'll get natural gas down there too. So gas often comes out first, and then later followed by petroleum, or depending on the depth you dig, you can actually get the petroleum first. But often you get a combination of the two, or one or the other. Both are often trapped in sort of rocks that have cracks and pores in them. They're in those rock layers, trapped beneath rock layers that are less permeable. And so that's essentially how it's obtained. Once it's obtained, there are basically two options for it. It has to be shipped somehow or transported somehow to a refinery, so it can actually be refined, or we can actually make useful products out of it. And that is either through a pipeline or through ships. And the pipeline here, I thought this one was really interesting. There's a fault here, so you've got to remember the Earth doesn't always stay completely still either. And so that means the ground here may be slowly moving, or maybe even be prone to small earthquakes and things like that. So this pipeline has some bends in it, and it looks like they've got, they're called there here Teflon shoes. So Teflon is quite a slippery or can be used to reduce friction, so that the pipe can actually slide slightly, so that essentially if the ground moves, the pipe doesn't just crack, but the pipe can move a little bit with it. So pipelines aren't without their problems either. I mean, very expensive to build a pipeline that goes all that way, but also you've got to monitor, you make sure that earthquakes, things like that, aren't going to damage the pipe, and if they do, that you can stop it, because you've got huge amounts flowing through there. In some areas of the world too, they're also prone to attack or abuse. I've heard stories of people drilling into what they thought was an oil pipeline to obtain, to try and steal some oil, and it actually turned out to be a natural gas pipeline, and so a section exploded. So they're not without their issues either, but I guess it depends the distance and where it's being transported, the nature of the countries through which it's being transported, and all of those sorts of issues. But that's one way of transporting crude oil and natural gas by land. The other option by sea, basically oil tanker, massive boats that basically transport that crude oil. So that's another way of getting it to the refinery. And as we know, these can have issues too if they crash. You get oil spills and things like that, which are pretty nasty. But again, I guess it's just managing the safety of it. So coal obtained through mining, petroleum or crude oil and natural gas obtained through drilling. Natural gas can also be obtained another way. Now, I guess this is still a type of drilling, but this is sometimes called fracking or hydraulic fracturing. And I thought I'd mention this because it's relevant to us in New Zealand too. There has been proposal to do fracking in certain parts of the country to obtain natural gas. I believe in the Hawke's Bay region it's been proposed. And there are arguments for and against it. Obviously, the argument for that, we could obtain a valuable resource, but people are worried that it could also contaminate water and things like that. So I'll quickly explain what fracking is, because I think it's valuable as a New Zealander. It's something that's, it may happen in New Zealand, and so to make an informed choice, you've got to know a little bit more about what it actually is. So again, it basically involves establishing an oil well or drilling. So you drill downwards, and then they use special drill bits or machinery to actually cause the drill to turn sideways. And so they call this the heel, and out this end the toe. So you can imagine like a foot. This is the heel and the toe, and they drill essentially sideways within a layer of rock often something like shale, something that has sort of pockets of natural gas trapped in it because it's got sort of pores or cracks or just areas where the natural gas is trapped within that. So originally, I guess natural gas was they went for the easier stuff where it was just a larger pocket of it, but these days it's become possible and worthwhile financially to try and go after the stuff that's a little bit more difficult where it's in lots of small pockets. But essentially what they do is they pump this pipeline full of fluid, fracking fluid, which is under high pressure. And that's mainly water, but it also has other chemicals in it. And they pump that down into the tube, and then down the end here, down at the toe, essentially they detonate a small charge, and that causes the rock here to sort of fracture, and any of the gas that's trapped in there can then come out through those fractures, those cracks, and it gets pushed. The pressure forces it back up the pipe with the water as well, and then up this end you can collect the gas. Now one of the issues is that the water you use is obviously contaminated with some of those fracking chemicals, those chemicals that help the process, as well as the natural gas and things like that. And so people are worried that it could, the small detonations and things like that could actually result in leakage into the water table. So further up at shallower depths you have water. So that's where what you normally think of as a well or a water well is when someone digs down and water is seeping out of the water table into their well. So this water can be very important for drinking water. It's connected with our drinking water, as well as for agriculture and things like that. So in a region like the Hawke's Bay in New Zealand, where there's a lot of farming and produce produced, water is a very valuable resource. And so people are worried, if the water got contaminated, that would be pretty devastating. What the risk is of that, I'm not really too sure. And that's currently, I guess, what's being debated is how high is that risk that could happen. So natural gas, important thing to note here, guys, natural gas, when we talk about natural gas, we're primarily talking about methane. And we'll talk a little bit more about what methane is when we look at the different types of hydrocarbons. So anyway, once they've detonated a small charge here, they may get gas coming in here for some time, but eventually that'll be used up. So they come back further along, back towards the heel, and detonate maybe another charge over here, and then when that's exhausted they come further back and detonate. And so they work their way back, detonating charges, releasing the natural gas that's trapped in the rock, and that gets pushed back up with the fracking fluid. And eventually when they're done, they'll seal up the pipe with cement, basically to make sure that if there is any residual stuff left, it's not going to leak out and you're not just going to have gas sort of slowly pouring out the top. And that's basically how it's done. So when you hear about fracking, hopefully you got a slightly better idea now what that means. So just to summarize, coal is extracted through mining. You get petroleum, so crude oil and natural gas through drilling, and fracking is another way that's being used these days especially to obtain natural gas or methane. So just a brief introduction there on how they're obtained, and I guess also we mentioned briefly how they're transported, so either by pipe or ship, but really just brief, and you don't probably need to know too much detail about those. So I'll leave it there and we'll get on to the next one.